Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD, Culture, and Stigma, a podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. Trigger warning, this episode will mention suicide. Classicist and creative writer Anne Carson wrote, "I'm interested in people who cut through things, cracks, cuts, breaks, gashes, splittings, slicings, rips. Me too. That's why I love talking to people associated with mental health nonprofits. Such organizations don't just respond to a need, although they do that too. They are also radical disruptors of the status quo, slicing through stigma and breaking open conversations about the disorder." Today, I'll be speaking with Paula Tusiani, who is on just such a tear. She co-founded Emotions Matter, a New York-based nonprofit whose mission is to connect and empower those impacted by BPD, to raise awareness about BPD and advocate for better mental health care. Emotions Matter offers peer support groups for those who've lost loved ones to BPD, and targeted support groups for men with the disorder, who are often marginalized due to the perception that BPD is a woman's disorder only. In addition, they host poetry writing workshops, yoga and mindfulness workshops, art shows, BPD fundraising walks, and an annual conference called BPD Fest. BPD can feel very isolating, so it lifts my heart to see Emotions Matter's dedication to creating not only dialogue about the disorder, but a whole community. As we'll hear in this first part of my conversation with her, Paula committed to BPD advocacy after the tragic loss of her sister Pamela, who died due to caretaker negligence while being treated for BPD and substance use disorder in a private residential facility in California. After her death, Paula and her family sued the facility, which, unbeknownst to them, hadn't been accredited as they thought. One reason I felt so drawn to interviewing Paula was because I also pursued a lawsuit against a California facility for caretaker negligence. 15 years ago, while I was committed to a psych ward after a suicide attempt, I was attacked by another patient soon after arrival. This patient had already assaulted a nurse, but her caretakers hadn't sequestered her. She stood up from her wheelchair, threw me to the ground, and beat me with her prosthetic leg. In doing so, she pulverized my liver, causing internal bleeding and landing me in critical care. After multiple blood transfusions and a week in the hospital, I was then handed a bill for $100,000 that I had to fight against. Like Paula and her family, I know how the medical records of a person with BPD are used against her, even when she is victimized, and even when she's dead. In the wake of Pamela's death, Paula founded Emotions Matter in 2015 with the help of two other women who also had a sibling with BPD. After conducting a series of focus groups, they determined a need for more social connection among those suffering from the disorder, both diagnosed individuals and their families. Meanwhile, she and her mother authored an amazing book called Remnants of a Life on Paper, a mother and daughter's struggle with borderline personality disorder, that includes poems, diary entries, and artwork from Pamela, as well as her mother's commentary on Pamela's fight to survive and deposition transcripts from the lawsuit. Her mother and her husband also founded the BPD Resource Center at the White Plains campus of New York Presbyterian Hospital, which has been helping people with BPD and their families for 20 years now. Here's the first part of my conversation with Paula, in which she'll tell me more about her background and the origin story for Emotions Matter, along with highlighting the most pressing needs when it comes to BPD today. I included a link to the website for this dynamic organization in the episode notes. So Paula, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you for having me.
To start, could you talk a little about your family's experiences with BPD and what led you to eventually co-found Emotions Matter?
Sure. It's a long and winding road, but it all
Yeah.
starts with my own family experience. My younger sister, Pamela Tusiani, was diagnosed with BPD in 1998. She was a junior in college. And to our knowledge, she really had a very normal upbringing. There were no signs of any mental health issues. Although this was a different period of time in the 80s and early 90s, it wasn't common for schools to always even have psychiatrists or social workers. So we would not have necessarily been aware of
Right.
issues. The only thing that was observable is she was a little bit quiet. Her communication pattern was a little different than, say, my brother and I. She was a little moody. She was a little quiet. She would isolate in her room a little more. But I think for the age that she was at the time, we thought it was very normative teenage behavior. But when she was in college, she wound up having a breakdown that she needed to be hospitalized for. And at the time, we were told it was major depression and
Yeah.
stress related. And we, as a family, of course, we dropped everything and tried to support Pamela through that time. But then there were other types of behaviors that began to emerge that were really new and also frightening. She started to engage in self-harm behaviors. She really started to struggle in relationships with communicating with others. She had a very sort of negative narrative about herself every time we would say, "Oh, you look so lovely today,"
Yeah.
or "Oh my gosh, your artwork is so beautiful," or "No, it's not. It's so ugly," or "I don't look good today," or "I don't feel good." And,
Right.
we just thought this was like Pamela being Pamela. We didn't realize that it was
Mhm.
anything larger until about a number of hospitalizations later. She kept sort of struggling with suicidal thoughts. And she would go into the hospital and come home, and she was being treated by a psychiatrist for major depression, but she wasn't really getting better. And eventually, about 6 months into our journey, we got the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, which
Right.
makes sense, when the doctor read my sister the symptoms and when they told my parents the symptoms, it really did make sense to put a name on what her experience was. The only problem is at the time, there weren't really providers that were treating BPD. If
Hmm.
you know a little bit about the history of BPD, it entered the DSM in 1980, but the treatments that we have available today, like dialectical behavioral therapy or transference focused therapy,
Yeah.
mentalization therapy, et cetera, were really being developed in the 90s and tested
Hmm.
in the population in the 2000s. So they really weren't available. So even though we had a diagnosis, Pamela was really being treated not for her BPD symptoms, but for other things. I mean, maybe it was
Right.
being treated a little bit, but not with one of the full evidence-based
Hmm.
modalities that exist today. After her diagnosis and not really having success in the New York area, it was suggested that Pamela consider a long-term treatment facility. She
Hmm.
lived there on and off for about 18 months and achieved different levels of stability, where she would be in relationships. She would even have a part-time job. She learned to really pursue creative outlets during that time. But every time she would make progress, there would be some setbacks related to some of her impulsive behaviors, because
Right.
even though maybe some of her depression was being managed or some of her anxiety, so some of the symptoms were being managed, but she was still struggling because, again, she wasn't really being treated for the BPD. So the internal symptoms were still there, and she was still using behaviors to kind of cope with those symptoms. Unfortunately, at one point, she was assaulted. So once that trauma occurred, she needed to find another setting where she could be safe. And what we discovered during that time was that she also had a co occurring substance use disorder.
Right.
And so at that time, we found another treatment facility for my sister in California. That was a dual diagnosis facility. And she went there and she actually did really well when
Hmm.
she got the substance use under control. She was sober. She had a steady boyfriend. She was going back to school. She was driving, living in an apartment, really functionally, the best that she had been in a long time. But
Right.
again, she still struggled with some of the BPD symptoms, particularly around her internal sense of self and love of self.
Right.
And that what that looked like on the outside to people was that her depression was worsening. So while she was there, one of the psychiatrists put her on a new antidepressant, which was a class of drugs that she had not tried before, called MAOI inhibitors. You may be familiar with MAOI inhibitors, like when you see TV commercials and it says, don't take this drug if you're on an MAOI inhibitor. Well, they're a very old class of antidepressants that were very popular in the 1950s. Before the SSRIs came out, and they're not used very much anymore because they have very strict food restrictions. And my mother, who was very, educated and smart and had done her homework about BPD, told the doctors, well, Pamela can be impulsive. She has borderline personality disorder. Do you think it's a good idea for her to take a drug that has all these food restrictions because she also enjoys food and eating? And they had said, oh, don't worry. We have monitors in the cafeteria that will monitor her food, or we'll work with her around this to manage it. And back in that day, like today, they have patches that you could wear that monitor your blood pressure and, things like, but back then it was up to the person to monitor food intake. And so unfortunately, one day in the facility, she had a slice of cheese pizza, and cheese is one of the contraindicated foods with MAOI inhibitors, includes things like chocolate and soy and cheese. And these were all foods that Pamela loved. Yeah. And she had a slice of pizza in the cafeteria, and she wound up having a massive brain hemorrhage. And sadly, she passed away within 48 hours of eating the pizza. And so what went from a 3-year ordeal of helping my sister manage her BPD now became a completely other ordeal, because now we were survivors of loss and losing our loved BPD, and trying to figure out what happened and how she died under the care of medical professionals that were supposed to be cheering her and helping her. And so my parents were involved in lengthy lawsuits against UCLA Medical Center and the facility where she was living for several years. With the settlement from the lawsuit, my parents founded the BPD Resource Center in New York to try to help families get what they felt was most missing in their experience of supporting Pamela, which was finding providers that were trained to treat BPD. Right. And they also, one of the terms of the settlement, because my mother, by training as a writer, she really wanted to write at some point about this story when she was in a place to do so. And so years after my sister's death, after sort of sitting with the story and reflecting on it, we wrote a memoir that came out in 2013 called Remnants of a Life on Paper, which after my sister died, we found all of these diaries in her room, and we didn't know she was an avid journaler. We knew she was a writer and we knew she was an artist, but we just didn't realize that she had all of this expression that she wasn't sharing with us. So we felt like it was really important also as a legacy to have Pamela's voice really be heard so that other people could relate to her experience and understand BPD. When the book came out, we, like any self-publishing authors, we would go out anywhere and talk for free and try to promote our books. Yeah. So we did a lot of talk for community groups, libraries, hospitals, and people would always come up to us after our presentation and say, oh, wow, we know someone with BPD, or we have BPD, or we love someone with BPD. How can we help? And, my parents, who really spent so many years of their life raising Pamela, supporting Pamela. And then there's nothing more devastating as a parent to lose a child. And I think that they felt that they had done what they needed to do in bringing this book to life. But as I was listening to these stories, at a point in my own life in my mid-30s, really still grappling with what happened to my family? What happened to my sister? There's just such injustice to this. I felt like we needed to do more, because when people came up to us at talks and said, I have this and your story is my story, what do I do? How do I meet other people with BPD? I feel like I'm the only one. And, I would look them in the eyes and say, you're not the only one. 1.6% of the population has BPD. That's like millions and millions of Americans. I'm going to introduce you to some other people that have BPD. Became the genesis of Emotions Matter is in 2015. We invited a lot of the people that we met at our book talks to form a walk team at the NAMI Walk in New York City, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And that was the day that I met a lot of my co-founding partners of Emotions Matter, where we decided let's form our own nonprofit to kind of meet this underserved need in the community for community support, peer support, advocacy, et cetera. So I said it was a long story to get to where we are today with our organization. but it all comes from, my love for my sister who died at the age of,
Yeah.
and she suffered tremendously because of BPD. And,
Mm.
with all my heart and soul, I just don't want other people to suffer the way she had to suffer. I want people to have the life that she deserved to have and to really achieve what's possible with recovery.
That's such a beautiful hope. Thank you for explaining that background. I have a couple of follow-up questions. As I told you, I just finished reading the memoir Remnants of a Life on Paper, and it's so moving and also so frustrating at different times because, like you're saying, in the 90s, these evidence-based treatments that we know about now, even though that sometimes there are limited access to them now, they were still being developed. So it was a bit of a just trying different things to figure out what worked back then. How do we treat this? How can we make Pamela feel better about herself and function better? And like you said, when she gets out to California, she does seem to really thrive when she gets the substance abuse under control. And of course, that's so common that people with BPD self-medicate. But one of the things that's so heartbreaking is that your family is so loving and was supporting her 100%, but the treatment facilities didn't seem to be doing what they needed to do to protect her. The one in Massachusetts, where they had an open setting, maybe that works for some people, but it also created dangers, I think, for someone who with impulsive behaviors. And then, of course, like you said, the California treatment facility that was not watching what she ate as promised. So in terms of checking for the safety record, the credentials, the expertise of potential treatment facilities, residential facilities that families might be considering, what would you recommend? What kind of best practices are there for finding the best place to treat a loved one with BPD?
It's complicated, right? Because
Yeah.
we are, in a country and in a mental health system where there aren't enough providers that are trained in these really fantastic evidence-based life-saving treatments. So we do have a supply and demand problem, and that's corroborated by the literature and the research.
Yes.
Right? Because these treatments are not all psychiatrists and psychologists get trained in these treatments in graduate schools. They're expensive. They require specialization. And when you're in a generalist practice, you often don't think about someone that does general surgery versus someone that's a cardiac thoracic surgeon. You have to do a specialization. Well, it's the same thing in psychiatry.
Yeah.
Is to treat more severe types of disorders and illnesses, you have to have specialty training.
Right.
And many people are not able to afford this extra specialization. So, I don't want to be blaming doctors, right? When you go in, still, I do believe that doctors, for the most part, have an intent and genuine desire to help everybody. But if you don't have the specialty training, and you have, somebody in your office repeatedly that's struggling with suicidal thoughts, that's struggling with what can feel complex interpersonal skills and frightening behaviors. Sometimes, doctors don't know what to do with these patients. And that's where some of the stigma comes from. They're difficult. Well, they're not difficult. They're really just hurting and they need help, but they don't know how to express how to get that help. So if you have BPD or you have a loved one with BPD and you don't really know where to find help, obviously research is extremely important. If you're looking for a doctor, check their credentials and see, or ask when you're screening for a doctor, say, what experience do you have working with patients with borderline personality disorder? How many have you treated? Is it 1? Is it 10? Is it, if you want to go to someone that has seen lots and lots of cases, right? Because no one case of borderline looks the same because it's a real spectrum type of disorder. So, ask about what experiences they have. Look at training. Are they actually certified in one of these trainings, or do they have just generalist knowledge? Have they taken courses? If they're not specially trained, are they affiliated with a group, a supervision practice, or an advisor that might have that training so they have support to get information that's accurate? So I would say that, unfortunately, when you're in a system where there isn't enough trained providers, I'm not going to tell somebody in a rural area in Idaho, don't go to that doctor.
Right.
You have to sometimes get what you can get, but it's still very important to ask questions so you're educated around what their qualifications are. And if they are not meeting your needs, if they're not treating your symptoms, if you feel like you're not getting better, then find another fit. Find somebody that can help you. Because I think in my sister's case, again, back then, we didn't have the language or the knowledge that exists today. As family members, we were trusting the doctors when they would say, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And we were taking it, I guess it was a different time too, that it was an era in which you just put all your faith in the professionals.
Yeah.
And I would say that most of the time in my experience, people with BPD really have good instincts about themselves and if their therapists are actually helping them. You know, my sister would always come home from a session and say, I don't know if this person really gets me. You know, like she kind of knew when something wasn't working, but we didn't know how to address that, you know? And so I think it's really important to do your homework. Don't be afraid to ask questions about experience and level of education, because that's how you're going to find the right person, right? So it's okay to advocate for yourself. And I think that, you know, when you're hurting and you see somebody hurting, like we just didn't know how to advocate for ourselves and for Pamela. But I would say that in this day and age, I think that, you know, there's always another therapist out there. If this one's not working for you and you're still struggling with intense suicidal thoughts, find somebody who can help you. There are good people out there, even if they're not totally trained, that can have empathy and understanding and help you.
Yeah, I think that is such an important message. When I was talking to Sarah Masland recently, she pointed out that based on a study one of her students did, they analyzed the ratio of treatment-seeking people with BPD to certified specialists trained in the evidence-based treatments for BPD. And in the US, it's nearly 6,000 treatment-seeking people for every one professional. In Canada, where I am, it's almost 10,000. And that's why she's trying to promote a more generalist approach to BPD, which is great. So like you're saying, you won't always find the ideal person. But the good news is we do have more options in the sense that these days you can look for someone who's online. You know, maybe there isn't someone in your area who you're connecting with or who is prepared to deal with, to help you with BPD in any way, but you can see what other options there are, either online or with telehealth over the phone. They're not ideal, but they're there. And I agree with you. I think, especially when I was a child and my parents were dealing with doctors, there was this culture of you just believe what the doctor tells you. But nowadays, I'm finding not just for BPD, but for other conditions I have, like lupus and endometriosis, you have to advocate for yourself, because not everyone is well versed in disorders, and especially with disorders that primarily are ascribed to women. That just seems to be a recurrent theme. So yeah, advocacy I think is so important. And one more question about Pamela and her effect on Emotions Matter before we go into a little more detail about the organization and BPD in general. She was such a talented artist and poet. In Remnants of a Life on Paper, you include reproductions of some of her artworks. And as a literature scholar, I really loved the poems. There was one in particular called Brain Hardware, which is sort of a revised version of a villanelle, a very complex and challenging poetic form with lots of rules, repeating lines, rhyme schemes. And I thought that one was so brilliant. And I know that Emotions Matter has put on an art show and also has poetry workshops. So I'm wondering, did learning about Pamela's artistic talents and the way that expressing herself seemed to help her, did that inspire these components of Emotions Matter?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what's so interesting, right? Is like growing up until she got sick, she was sort of quiet. And once she got sick and she was in and out of the hospital, her creative side just went off the chart. And she was able to express herself in ways that we had just never seen. Like we didn't know all of this emotion was there. And it was almost like the therapy kind of brought it out. And so as I started working with people with BPD at Emotions Matter, I started to recognize the pattern of like, oh, wow, like a lot of people with BPD have these gifts. People who come to us who different phases of recovery, but incredibly creative and expressive. And like my brain doesn't work that way. But somebody with BPD, like it's just, I really do think that for whatever the challenges are with expression in words and interpersonal communication, expression in other mediums is just natural and fluid and anything that can get emotions out. So that's why whether it's acting, theater, dance, the written word, poetry, comedy, improv, art. And so we try to highlight the strengths of people with BPD, because for me, I never really saw my sister as like disordered or sick. I mean, she was my sister and I loved her.
Right.
And I knew that she was just suffering from this thing that she didn't want to have. And I also recognized she had incredible talents and like she was somebody that like I cook, I use recipes. She could just make things up and they would be like the most incredible dishes. And I'd be like, where did this come from? She never took a cooking lesson in her life. I just think that it's so important when people are struggling with BPD to be able to lift up their talents, because that's how the pathway to recovery is recognizing that you can live and that there are things to live for. And there's so many things about you that are beautiful that contribute to this world in meaningful ways that other people recognize. Because, when you have a brain that's coded to think negatively, it filters everything in the world as negative, and it makes it so hard to like love yourself and to believe in yourself, right? When you have this incoherent sense of yourself that you can't control. And so I believe that part of recovery, and I've seen this many times over, is just learning to love yourself is also learning to express yourself and do things you enjoy. And be with people that, like my sister used to go to like an art workshop and she'd go do sculpture, and just being in those settings where she could be around other people doing art and be seen as an artist, not as a sick person. Like that's so important for building sense of self and working toward recovery. So yeah, she definitely inspired it, but it was also inspired by all of the people that I started to work with that had BPD and were working at recovery and recognizing that there were similar traits. And I was like, okay, this isn't just my sister. This is common to a population, and we need to build on this and do something around it.
Right. And you offer so many different things through Emotions Matter. So I want to talk about a couple of them now. You offer online peer support groups through Zoom. I've attended a couple of those. Great. As well as support groups for people who have lost loved ones due to BPD. Can you tell a little about how these groups work, just if anyone wants to try them? And are there any other online groups that you're offering at the moment?
Sure. So all of our programs and services at Emotions Matter really were developed by people with BPD. So everything, all of our stigma-free publications, all of our programs really have come because people in the community have said, hey, we need this. There's a gap that exists around this. One of the first needs that was identified at Emotions Matter was a lack of a recovery community, and the social isolation being so profound for people. They just really needed a community and wanting to connect with other people with BPD. So that's when our closed Facebook group was formed in 2016, and that still exists today. And then maybe around 2018, a little bit later, people in the organization started to say, hey, we don't just want this Facebook group. We need more. We need face-to-face. And so at that time, we put together a committee of people with lived experience that were interested in sort of looking at the feasibility of peer support groups. And we looked at other organizations that had peer support group models. We were trying to decide, do we replicate other people's models or do we need to create our own? And after many, many discussions and workshopping it, we realized that we needed to really create our own model that worked for our community, with guidelines that would work for our community, with things like intentional welcome and hospitality so that people would feel safe, with recovery principles so that it was really focused on giving people tools they could walk away with and implement their daily life. So we developed these 4 different recovery principles that are themes in the meeting that circulate: community, purpose, believing in yourself and your ability to recover, trust, and advocacy, asking for your recovery needs or advocating for your recovery needs. So our groups are 75 minutes. They're run by volunteers who are trained with lived experience. We offer in the range of 6 to 8 groups online a month. Sometimes, depending on our number of volunteers, that could be up around 10 groups a month, but they're at no cost to the community, and you can go at any time and register for a group. And those groups are funded by our BPD walk and our fundraisers throughout the year.
Nice.
But we do have other programs at Emotions Matter. Most recently, we're starting to develop now specialty groups for subpopulations that need another level of support. So we now have a BPD and men's group that meet in a cohort every 6 months. And we're building out other groups as we have volunteers that can run those groups. We offer wellness workshops to help people with self-care and wellness, trying new ways of taking care of oneself. And they're run by people with lived experience. So our writing workshop is once a month, and it's where people come in and write poetry together in the context of the workshop. We have a yoga workshop that we've recently been piloting. We've had art workshops in the past. We do offer a peer conference once a year on different topics related to recovery. This year's conference is on April 20th. It's a virtual conference, and we'll have lots of panels and conversation cafes and clinicians, as well as people with lived experience that will be talking about different aspects of recovery. The theme this year is living beyond the borderline. So in addition to our conference, yes, we do have a loss group, which is a bereavement group for family members like myself that have lost loved ones, because even though we're not a grief organization, we realize that people who lose loved ones, part of the grief journey that I learned from my own family is like needing to understand when Pamela was gone, like what happened to Pamela and what happened to family as a result of Pamela's illness, was really needing to process the BPD, which at the time when you're living through it, it's like you're kind of in crisis mode all the time. At least that's where we were sister. But after she wasn't there anymore, we really had to understand what it was like to love and lose somebody with BPD, and also process the anger that we had toward the system and the professionals and how we were let down and stuff like that. So we do offer a grief group once a month for that, very marginalized population that needs its own support. And we offer other educational workshops and seminars, panel discussions throughout the year. So to learn more about us, just go to our website and get involved.
I'd like to thank Paula Tusiani-Eng and everyone who works and volunteers for Emotions Matter. Please come back on September 1st for the second half of my interview with Paula. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself and have a great day.